to be here tonight, but this was not my idea. I was told years ago that I was to never volunteer to speak at a meeting, but in the event I was asked, I should do so. In the event I still had a message of recovery. And when this lovely lady asked me to speak, I couldn't say no to her. I don't care what she asked. It's good to be here tonight. I'm a little bit nervous. I'm always nervous, especially when I talk before my home group. I can speak at an international convention and not be this shaky. But it's always a little bit different when you're talking to your home group. A little bit different. But I am glad to be here. I'm a little bit uptight. Daniel gave me a cup of water a while ago, a bottle of water, and I put it under here. I remember the first time that Tom Alistair carried me down to Richlands, North Carolina, to speak. I was still in prison at the time. I had been in for several years, and I was standing up behind an old podium. It was not near this nice, and it was a little stage there about this high. And I was talking about how nervous I was, and I could really feel my knees were shaking because I had not spoken before a group down there before. And the chairperson had set a tall tea glass of water down at the edge of the podium. And I was talking about how nervous I was and how my knees was knocking, and my foot accidentally hit that glass of water under the podium. It began running out from under that podium, went over to the edge of the stage, went down onto the floor, and went directly over toward a couple of ladies that were sitting on the front row and had their purses on the floor. One of them grabbed up her purse and moved, and she said, "My God, that boy is nervous." Well, I checked it out. The top is on the water tonight, and I won't be kicking it. But if you see anything running, you better run. I'm going to tell one funny story that will help me get over my nervousness. This joke could have been coming from Sanford because there's a street there that's got a couple of blocks. There's no driveways up to those homes. And they park down on the street at the curb. Well, this drunk was walking up the street humming. He had almost a full fifth of wine in his coat pocket. It was almost full, and his belly was full. And as he was walking along, there was a man coming out of the house up there. They were moving furniture, coming down onto that walkway at the curb, and putting that furniture into a truck. As that drunk was coming up that sidewalk, a man came down those steps. He had about a 6-foot high grandfather clock on his back, and he's walking like that. When he got down on the sidewalk, the drunk run right into him, knocked the poor old man down. And the man was sitting over there next to the curb. The clock is laying here, glasses on the sidewalk, springs are coming out of the clock. And the drunk is sitting over here, and they looking at each other. And the man that had the clock looked at that drunk. He said, "You are the drunkest SOB I have ever seen in my life. Why don't you watch where you're going?" And the drunk looked at him and said, "You're the stupidest SOB I have ever seen. Why don't you wear a wristwatch like everybody else?" Now, that's all I got to say. It's going to be funny. I am an alcoholic, and I've known it for many, many years. Yesterday was my 88th birthday, And it's the first time I've ever celebrated 88 years of Belly Button's birthday. And I can assure you that will be the last time I ever celebrate 88 years of sobriety. I won't live that long again. But I'm grateful to be here tonight, and my sobriety date is February 16th, 1964. That entails a sobriety date of 57 years, last February the 16th. And I'm truly grateful that God in His mercy enabled me to find the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Although I'm a very, very low-bottom drunk, and I don't know of anyone that comes into AA that I'm able to look down on. I'm not qualified to do that because of where I've been, what has happened in my life, and the insanity that took place when I began to drink. I had no idea that I would become an alcoholic when I started drinking. I had been warned about it because I had a brother that was, in fact, two brothers who were alcoholic. There were 6 boys in my family. I'm the baby boy. There were 6 girls. I'm the only boy living. I have a baby sister living in South Carolina, and she'll be 86 years old in December. And she's been a real meaningful person in my life for many, many years. Incidentally, that 6 and 6 means there was 12 of us. Mom and Dad finally found out what was causing it, and they quit. And my older brother became a minister. He started preaching when he was 16 years old and left home with a 7th grade education. Went and got in school down in South Carolina and went into college later on, and he became a doctor of divinity. And he's a guy that really and truly made something of his life. I'm a guy that really messed my life up once I began to drink. Because when I was born full of fear. And my father always wanted us, don't get on that fence and walk on that wall. Don't do this, don't do that. You're going to get hurt. I don't have the money to take you to a doctor, and the doctor can't come out here in these boondocks and help us. He taught us to be fearful and to be careful. And that's the way I grew up, full of fear, apprehension, feeling that I was backward and not as well qualified to play in the physical games like other boys were. I was tall and skinny. In fact, when I went into the Army at the age of 19, I weighed 140 pounds and 6'2". Very, very skinny, very frail. And I had been drafted when I was 19 years old. The Korean War was in progress. I hadn't done any drinking to amount to anything in my life up to that point other than sipping a few beers with guys who began running around with me because at 17 years old I had my first automobile. I had dropped out of school. My father didn't make me go back to school when we quit farming, and I sure was glad to quit farming. I went to work in the cotton mill, and it wasn't long before I bought a car. And those guys that I knew began running around with me on weekends because I had an automobile and I had some money in my pocket and they didn't. And I became popular for the first time. And we sipped a few beers. They drank beer. I sipped a few, and I pulled out a lot of good beer for that first 2 years that I was running around with them between the age of 17 and 19. I didn't like the taste of beer. It made me nauseous. I didn't get the effect produced by alcohol in me. I just didn't enjoy it. And I'd pour out a lot of good beer when those guys weren't looking. I just didn't want them to know I was drinking so little. I knew why Budweiser had all those horses around. That apparently was where it come from. I didn't like it. But anyway, when I got down to Fort Jackson, took basic training, got in there in June, and in August of that year, we were on the firing range. And I had already fired a weapon that morning. I was pulling targets at the time. And the range officer made an announcement. Cease fire, cease fire. Everybody quit firing. And he announced, the Koreans have just signed a truce a little bit ago. We're going to give y'all off the rest of the day. When you get back to the company area and clean up your equipment, the company commander has been instructed to give you off and let you go to the beer garden or wherever you choose to go. Well, many of the guys went to the beer garden and began to sip that 3.2 beer. I didn't go. I didn't like the taste of it, and I wasn't going to get involved. Anyway, later on that year, I had been reassigned to Fort Lee, Virginia, into the quartermaster school. I had a heart murmur at that time, and I was not supposed to get involved in a lot of physical activity. But anyway, I went into the quartermaster, and they didn't care about physical activity. I did the same thing the other guys did. In November of that year, and this was in '53, I went home to Roxborough, where I was born and raised. And that Saturday night, a couple of friends found out I was at home, and they came by and picked me up. They wanted to go to a dance. And we went out to an old dilapidated building that had been a garage. It had been converted into a round and square dance area. It was about the size of this room here. And that was a stage. And I went into that dance that night with those two guys, and they had already been drinking, and I had not. And I'm standing back in the corner of that room, out of healer, and I'm doing what I always did out in public. I'd watch you laugh, talk, dance, socialize, but I couldn't get involved. I wouldn't start a conversation with you. If you started talking to me, I might talk a little bit. But I was backward and country and uneducated. And as I stood there at the heater watching these people, I noticed that a lady had come up to the window and bought her ticket. And then when she came to the door and started in, walking across that floor toward the heater where I was. And I'm standing there, 6'2", 140, flat top haircut, about like it is tonight, except it was a different color and a whole lot thicker. My shoes were real shine. My uniform was real tight fitting. It was very neat. I had on little pins on the shoulders to make it look dressier. Had on all the medals I had earned that afternoon at the PX. And she came walking over that way, and I tell you, I had never seen anything like that in all my life. Everything was just moving, just beautifully, as she walked across that floor. I mean, humongous. And she started talking to me, and I'm embarrassed, because my preacher brother had told me to watch out for naughty girls. And I could tell this very good possibility that this was a naughty girl. And she began talking to me, and I was embarrassed because I had been warned by my preacher brother. You get involved with a naughty girl, or drink white whiskey like your father, you go to hell. And I tell you, she started talking to me, and I'm embarrassed. And won't but a little bit, I was relieved because she asked me, would I escort her out to the car? I did. I escorted her out to her car in a well-lit parking lot, and we got in that car. I was very fearful. I had fantasized about things like this, but nothing like that had ever been a reality. We got in that car, and she started talking some junk to me, and I'm embarrassed at things she's saying. She had already started the radio up. She started the motor up. She got the heater started up. And when she come back from under that glove compartment where the heater was, she put her arm around me and tried to start me up. I'm ill at ease and discontent. And I'm not knowing what to do. I got to thinking about what Mom and Dad had said, my preacher brother. And she was saying things to me that was really, I'd never heard anyone talk to me like that. But anyway, she had her arm around me and started smooching. And she wasn't making much progress. I was very fearful. And it wasn't long before she reached under the seat and came out with a pint of white moonshine whiskey. She got 2 cups out of the glove compartment and poured out those cups of whiskey. And she's sitting there holding those things. And she's still talking to me. And I got to thinking about what my preacher brother had said, Mom and Dad had said, thinking about the possibilities of the evening if I give in to this. And I'm nervous and fearful. And finally, I looked at her, and she's beautiful. And I looked at them, and them told me to take a drink. She handed that cup to me, and I turned it up and put it down, and I had a couple of 3 more in that car that night. And I can't tell you any further on that other than about 2:30 in the morning. I'm back at home in the bed upstairs. My uniform is on the other bed. And I'm laying there. For the first time in my life, I found out that I had a solution to my problem. That magic ingredient I had been introduced to that night was the answer to what the fear in me was. It was the answer to the frustration and the bitterness and inability to communicate with people. Because in that car, I had become very talkative. I had become very brave. I got a little bit too aggressive. And she had invited me to go into the dance with her. And I did. And when that fiddle and guitar and banjo struck up a tune, she grabbed me by the hand, and around the floor we went. We circled that room about twice. I had never danced before in my life, and all of a sudden I became free of the stare. I learned to dance real quick, and we had a ball that night. They did the bunny hop, and I got so carried away in that the ushers asked us to leave. I enjoyed that bunny hop. I could do it good. And then when I'm in that bed that night, I'm thinking about all the fun I'd had. How that I had grown up and become a man. How I had accomplished some things I had never been able to accomplish before. And I began drinking that way on weekends. It became a habit. And then after a while of this habit I had accumulated, I began to think about Fort Lee, Virginia. When these guys are going into Richmond and Petersburg drinking beer and having a party on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, why not join them? And I began doing that. And I discovered that there in Virginia, alcohol would do the same thing for me on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, just as much as it did on Friday or Saturday night back in North Carolina. And I enjoyed that. And that really became a habit. And over a period of time, it grew into an obsession. And I was drinking because I needed to drink. And it relieved me of all my frustrations and fears and apprehension. And I could socialize and talk and act like other people. And it really grew on me that way. I was honorably discharged in '55, But in in October of '56, I went back into the Army. I had gotten in the National Guard when I got out. I had been promoted in the National Guard from PFC to corporal. And I was going back in the Army in 1956, in October of '56, because of problems I had, of having been fired over and over again as a result of going into the meal drinking. I had been fired because I'd lay out. And over and over and over, my first cousin was the foreman, and he kept giving me a chance. And it got to the place that he would not hire me anymore. And I also had another problem. My girlfriend told me that we should get married. I told her I was in no condition to get married. She said, the condition I'm in, we'd better get married. And we did. Mom and Dad loaned me $100. And I paid a small down payment on a ring, gave it to her. My brother-in-law and sister carried us to Bennettsville, South Carolina, and we got married. And that's the most miserable night I ever had in my married life up until that night. I discovered some things about my girlfriend that I had not known because I had been too drunk to observe her. And I won't bring out what those discoveries were, but it was not very pleasant. Anyway, that was in October of '56 that I was married. And shortly thereafter, 9 days later, I was back on active duty. I was going to get as far away from North Carolina and her as I could. And I signed up to go to Korea. And when I arrived in Korea, I had made up my mind on the ship that I would not drink in Korea. I was going to quit having that trouble I had with booze, of being totally unpredictable, unable to control myself. I didn't know where I'd go, what I'd do, who I'd get up with, who I'd insult, who I'd steal from, or who I'd loan money to, or what. I didn't know what was going to happen. Lost my car many times. Lost it. It took me one time, it took 3 days for the MPs to find it in Fort Lee, Virginia. And I had lots of problems as a result. In Korea, though, I made up my mind, no drinking. And I went 5.5 months in Korea without drinking. And during that 5.5 months, I had been Company Soldier of the Month 5 consecutive times. I had been Battalion Soldier of the Month 3 consecutive times. And the company commander put my name before the promotion board, and I was promoted to sergeant. About 3 or 4 months later, I had another demotion. I went from sergeant back down to corporal because of getting involved in some blackmocketing and some stealing and some things like that to facilitate the drinking habit that I had picked up again just as soon as I made sergeant. And the weekend that I had been promoted, I went out on Saturday night and I began drinking. And on Sunday morning, when I came to, I was in an NCO room and there was a dresser on my right-hand side. I reached over, got the filth and started drinking. Saturday night, I don't recall getting back to the barracks, but Sunday, I looked on that dresser, there was a different half of filth sitting there. And I began drinking that Monday morning. And it wasn't long before the company commander was fed up with me. I no longer looked like that soldier of the month, that battalion soldier of the month. My job performance had deteriorated, and they had put a PFC in there to help me out on. And they got tired of that after a while. But anyway, I made it back to Fort Lee, Virginia in 58. My daughter, when I got home from Korea, was about 13 months old. I met her for the first time, loved her immediately, and that was in October of 58. In January of 59, I walked out on that little girl. I walked out on that wife number one. I was determined I'd never live with her again. I was at the point that I could not buy groceries. I could not pay light bills, phone bills. I could put oil in the heater. I couldn't do anything but drink, 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 living to drink and drinking to live. And one Sunday night, I walked away from her. I went down to the highway and put up my thumb. No longer had a driver's license, no longer had a car. A Mack truck stopped and picked me up. And when I got into that truck that night, he said, "Soldier, why are you crying?" I couldn't tell him I was walking out on a wife I didn't love. Couldn't tell him I was walking out on a little girl that I did love. Couldn't tell him that I was living to drink and drinking to live. And I went off to sleep in that truck. When we got to Petersburg, Virginia, he let me out. And I walked from there down to the company area. That began a lot of trouble there at Fort Lee. And after a period of time, I got caught in Richmond, Virginia. I got a job as a lifeguard, making extra money, and I had bought another car. And I got caught for driving under the influence. And then in Richmond, Virginia, I was caught for driving under the influence, hit and run, driving after a license revoked, resisting arrest and striking a police officer. And I had all those charges coming up. And while they were pending, I was caught again in Colonial Heights on basically the same thing. And the judge consolidated all those charges. He called the company commander. He said he'll be going to jail. And he was right. When I did go to court, they sentenced me to 90 days in jail and a $575 fine. Eventually, I was discharged at that. I went back to Roxborough to live with Mom and Dad. They says no drinking. I stayed out there home, and they introduced me to a lady that was a Sunday school teacher. And after 5.5 months of dryness, going with her to church, living the kind of life I should, she asked me to marry her, and I married wife number 2. A year later, I had put this woman through a lot of hell because I wasn't helping her pay the bills. She owned the house, she owned the car, and she was a nice lady. And I was miserable to her. I was a problem to her. And in January of 63, I started drinking on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning. My wife would say to me, "You going to work today?" "Yes," I said, "I'm going to work." I turned to get off the bed that morning. My elbow hit something on the pillow. It made a loud noise, a clanging noise. I didn't know what it was. And it was 2 pints of white moonshine whiskey. And I sat down on the side of the bed and began drinking that. And my wife came from the kitchen in there and saw what I was doing, and she walked up in front of me. And I can assure you, she did not sound like a Baptist Sunday school preacher. She sounded strictly from the pool room. And she began telling me some things that she had told me many times that year. "You're sorry, no good, low-down drunk. You're no good to me, to your daughter, to your employer, to your family, to the community. You're nothing but a drunk, and that's all you'll ever be." And she said, "When I get home this afternoon at 3 o'clock, I want you out of my house, out of my life, out of my heart forever." And she went on to work that morning at 7 o'clock. I don't remember leaving home that day. That was a Monday. And I was told that I went to town, and that uptown I was refused to be served beer on Court Street down Roxborough because I was drunk. I learned this when I was in court later on. And when I was in court later on, I heard the judge tell the sheriff to present the evidence they had against me. You see, that Monday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, the sheriff was in his office, and he looked out the window, saw me on the street drunk, and he was going to come out and arrest me. And he said the telephone rang across the room. His secretary was not working. He went over to answer the telephone, and when he came back to the window to see where I was, he didn't see me, and he forgot about it. And I've wished 1,000,000 times that he had arrested me that Monday afternoon, because sometime about 2 hours after that 4 o'clock time that he gave, it's when I got into trouble. The judge listened to what the sheriff had to say, and then he said, "Young man, please stand." And I stood up, and he says, "I hereby sentence you to the North Carolina Department of Correction for a period of 40 years plus natural life at the expiration. Take him out of here, Sheriff." They carried me into Central Prison with those commitment papers. I'd never been in prison. I should have been frightened. I had been in jail. I'd pulled that 90-day jail sentence, but I can tell you Central Prison is a lot different from a 90-day jail sentence. And I'm in that prison, and I can't sleep. I don't like the food. I don't like the clothing. I don't like the confinement. And I can't understand why God let this thing happen to me. And I'm mad and full of rage and bitterness. Can't get anything to drink. Plenty of bars, but nothing like the kind of bars I had been accustomed to. But anyway, I'm in there. And I was given a good job. About 3 weeks into that job, I was a clerk in the classification section. Inmates were doing those jobs in those days. Free people are doing them today, and they're making good money at it. But I was made a clerk. And the inmates there took me into their confidence and told me how that things was being smuggled in to Central Prison. And I began taking those things because they enabled me to sleep. I absolutely could not sleep unless I had some of that alcohol in my system or some of those other things that enabled me to sleep. And this went on. June of '63, I got fired from that job, given a job in the print shop, learning to be an offset press operator. And I learned to print real well. And I stayed in that print shop for a couple of years working. And in June of '63, a guy asked me to go to a meeting with me, and I went to that meeting to get out of the cell block. And it was a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I began attending that meeting every week with him. And I'd sit in the back of the row. Free people come in and share their experience and talk about love, and sometimes they'd hug the inmates and say, "I love you." And I knew it was love already there. 2 jokers on the back row were holding hands over Thursday night. And I didn't want no part of it. And this went on for a while. And February 16th, 1964, I started drinking. On a Sunday afternoon, I was in the library writing a letter to my mother, and a guy came in and put something on the table in front of me, and I took it and chased it with some coke I had there. It wasn't long before I went out behind the prison there to the chapel and went down to the last window on the right-hand side of that chapel. and dug down into the ground where I had some plastic dollars. I dug up those dollars and went to the bootlegger. Got me some drink, got me some other stuff, and I went back to the cell block and proceeded to get drunk and passed out in my cell block. I'm up on the 4th floor, 40 feet up, 2-man cell. I come to that night before 8 o'clock, about 8 o'clock. I came to and took a look at where I was, at the way I was conducting myself. I'd never get out, never ever get out. Nobody would ever go to work for me. And I was hopeless, helpless. Couldn't get drunk, stay drunk as long as I wanted to stay drunk, and I couldn't get sober, I couldn't get off of it. And I was doomed to that kind of existence forevermore. I had been entertaining suicide for several weeks. Tonight is the night. I have enough to give me the nerve to do it. I took everything that I had, drank that last bottle of alcohol, a small bottle that had been smuggled from the prison hospital, and I drank that. And I stood up at that door, 40 feet up. There's a catwalk down, about that wide. I stood up at that door waiting for that guard to pull that lever, and that door would slide open, and I could step out onto the catwalk over the railing head first. I stood there waiting for that door to open. I had been praying, I had been crying. I was totally committed to plunging over. A guy had already done that about 6 or 7 months earlier, and he was dead when the guards got to him on the floor. But for the grace of God, that would have been me. I passed out, blacked out, or whatever you want to call it. You can say what you want to about it. But I believe this. The next morning when I went out of the cell block, inmates on the right and on the left said, "What was going on in there last night?" I said, "What are you talking about?" They said, "Last night you cried out loud enough for everybody on this road to hear you. God, if you help me get back to AA, I'll cry." I don't remember saying that or praying that prayer, but I do know this, that I came to that night. I'm on my knees at that commode, and my head is in that commode, and I'm vomiting and craving and crying and passed out. Sometime later I came to. I went back to AA the following meeting night, and I didn't go to the back of the room like I had been doing for 8 months. I had never gotten involved in any way, helping make coffee, helping mop, helping set up, a takedown. I didn't do anything. But when I went back to AA that next time, I sat down on the lift inside the podium, and I began to listen. And I began to pick up pamphlets and take them to the cell block and read them at night rather than going down watching television. And about 2 weeks after I did that, Tom Iveston was the alcoholic rehabilitation officer. He had 7 years of sobriety at that time. He has 63 now. He had 7 years of sobriety. And I went up and started talking to him that night. And he told me what I needed to do. He reached over on the literature rack and got a copy of the big book, the second edition at that time, and gave me that book and told me what to do with it. And I began to get in it. And I began to get active in the group. A year and a half later, I walked up to him and told him, "I don't have the quality of sobriety that some people have coming in here. How can I get it?" And he told me to get into that book and do what it says, take the action. And I got into that book and began to read it, and I made an unconditional surrender this time. And I wanted to find that higher power that it was talking about. and I began to pray. And then I made that decision that I would turn my will in life over to the care of God as I understood it. And I did that. And I made the inventory and found out I had been a sick cookie since I was a kid. I brought it into my teenage years and carried over into adulthood. And I was a prime example waiting to put a drink into my system where I would get the obsession of the mind, the ideology of the body, the insane compulsion to drink. And I had that. And I had had it for years and years and years. And then I found out that I had to pray about my shortcomings and defects of character, and I did that. I had lots of defects. My character was not what it should be. And I began to look at ways and means that I could make restitution in prison. And then I found out that I could pray about a lot of things that I needed to pray about and write letters. And the book says that we can write letters under circumstances when it's necessary, and I wrote those letters. And I can tell you, as a direct result of getting into that book, as Tom suggested, I found a way of life that I'm still living today. This program works if we work it. I'm grateful. Tom enabled me to eventually end up in Sanford, where Waylon was the superintendent at the Sanford Advancement Center. I met him in November of 70. November 70, I met Waylon. He was the superintendent. Tom had been sent up there to replace him because Waylon was going to be going to Nash County to be superintendent down there at that correctional center. After about 2 years there at the Advancement Center, I had really been working hard. I had edited a book, the story, while I was in Central Prison at the Advancement Center. I began editing a newsletter, doing it on a monthly basis. And about 2-3 years ago, I presented Waylon with one copy of every edition that we had done for 2 years. I also did the same thing to Tom. I presented him one copy of that newsletter. And I bet Waylon still got his. Waylon was one of the best superintendents I could possibly imagine. And I was very humble. And I'm going to say this, he might not like it. But Waylon, a while back, when Tom was disabled, Waylon asked me to be his sponsor. Now, who ever heard of an ex-superintendent asking an ex-inmate to be the sponsor? It can only happen in Alcoholics Anonymous. There's no way I can ever be as good a sponsor to him as he was a superintendent to me and those other people that was under his supervision. I love you, Waylon, still do. Love his wife, too, and family. I got out in 81 and went to work with the phone company. And after 20 years with that phone company, Tom offered me a job to work as an inmate counselor in the alcoholism drug program. And they got me taking some courses from East Carolina University. And the day I retired from the phone company on Friday, went to work for Tom on Monday, working in that program. Did that for 2 years by contract. I'm grateful for all of the good things that have come my way, for a way of life that I'm so undeserving of. But I believe with all my heart that God in His infinite mercy gave me another chance. February 16th, 1964. And I'm as committed to Alcoholics Anonymous today as I've ever been in my life. And I fully intend to stick with it for the rest of my days, one day at a time. Because this thing works with word. And it tells us to keep on practice, practice, practice. What would happen to a football team if they didn't practice? What would happen to an alcoholic in AA if he quits practicing and living the program? He'd go right back to the old wild life. And I don't want that to happen to me, because I've got a fairly good life today as a result of God and His infinite mercy giving me a chance. I've taken advantage of it, and I hope and pray that for the rest of my days I'll be able to walk with dignity and respect and hold my head up, because this program is my life today. I'm not as active as I used to be, but I feel like it's going to increase once this illness is under control, and I'll be able to travel like I once did. I've been in 30 states carrying the message. I've been in about 15 different prisons out of state carrying the message, and I'm grateful for those opportunities. I love you guys. I love you gals. And I hope and pray that you'll continue to grow and prosper in the AA way of life. God bless you.